The causes and reaction to the controversy in the O.J. Simpson case. Talk about that. So the media coverage. Obviously, the media is a huge role in the O.J. Simpson case. Several areas that I'll talk about, but particularly this was almost, even though it was a real trial, almost a television program. It had all the aspects of um, what make for great movies and television. It had drama, it had controversy, it had conflict, and could be watched and reported on, and was daily. And the verdict, as it was delivered, and the leading up to the case, and OJ's arrest, and all these things that were doubtless a dream for journalists to cover. But I chose for the picture of this slide the famous OJ trying on the glove, where later Johnny Cochran says, if it doesn't fit, you must acquit. And this idea that they tried to work out Simpson's defense case. And the other famous images, him holding up his hands with the gloves on, saying it doesn't fit. Other moments and some pictures that will be in here. O.J. Simpson's mugshot, the Time magazine coverage of that, the Newsweek coverage of that, the controversy concerning that, which pictures will show up in these slides. The pictures of the Dream Team, the coverage of even the prosecution, Marcia Clark's haircut, and all these different aspects of things that we can see, these kind of well-known images, some like this one with the glove, more famous than others. But how do we have access to these? Well, because it was televised, it was photographed. The proceedings, the OJ case, the famous moment at the end where one of the jurors, signaled to OJ as he walked out with the Black Power hand signal, and just all these things that could be seen and watched contributed to this environment of gaining interest. But the fact that it was real also had so much buy-in from the American watching public. And so it was the most, according to USA Today, the most publicized criminal trial in history so far. And I don't think there's any reason to dispute that. About 150 million Americans watched the verdict on television, and there were reports of lower usage of plumbing and water as people wanted to watch live and weren't going to the bathroom. There was loss of productivity at workplaces as people found ways to watch these, even before the trial of the watching O.J. Simpson's car chase in the Broncos. His friend AC drove him around on the 405 freeway, and the ordering of pizza to watch that, the changing of the over to watching the car chase even on sports networks. So this was hugely televised. It made for great television, inarguably. And so the Simpson case generated discussion also about the justice system itself, and concerns about the media undermining the judicature. I talk about the fairness. Now, there were several interruptions of the proceedings. Now, this is the right of the defense. They're able to call in when they feel there are procedural errors, the things that are unfair, things that are conjecture, hearsay, anything like that. Of course, these are the rights of a criminal trial. But and this isn't to necessarily just speak to fairness, but just to talk about the issue itself. There were so many different theories and things that were picked up by the defense, these ideas that they were throwing, all kinds of things, everything out there, and they're also bringing up every little issue and trying to extend the length of the trial as long as possible. I mean, which is what a defense does, and it was doubtless effective as well. But it did make it difficult to really have a coherent presentation from the prosecution of what their case against O.J. Simpson actually was. Now, that's not necessarily to say it was unfair. It's just to say, can these interruptions, is it a good idea for them to be constant? It's a good idea for the defense, but I mean for the sake of justice itself. So the judicial process caused controversy because there were obviously concerns about letting a guilty man go free, even if there were issues of police, racism with one of the main detectives, or evidence not being handled properly, or being handled in a way that was exact procedure. That is that enough basis, despite what the evidence shows, to let a guilty man go free after this bloody double homicide? On the other hand, if the evidence does not drive every step of the way, and there is the possibility that the evidence was corrupted in some way, not through a conspiratorial type of way, I just mean that the evidence did not lead necessarily to that conclusion, are they punishing an innocent man? And I don't believe that they were, but in a class, I've had students who have gone over this case, and what they came to one group of students came to, they believed OJ committed the murders, but they didn't believe the prosecution made a strong enough case in order to take a guilty verdict from the jury. So I'm thinking, so as the thoughts are coming together, I'm trying to word what I'm saying. But that's kind of the problem. And that's kind of the focus of the OJ case, and what makes it kind of so interesting and a little bit frustrating, honestly, is that if this murder was committed by OJ and the court just doesn't present or the prosecution just doesn't present a strong enough case, is that justification enough to let an alleged murderer go free? On the other hand, that's exactly why those requirements and restrictions are there in the first place. And that's part of the risk, is the overall idea of the presumption of innocence. But if their murders really were committed by O.J. Simpson, then is it really just to allow that not guilty verdict, in the sense of, not that the jury can decide whatever it wants, but is it better to focus so much on the handling of the procedure as opposed to looking at the overall picture of, was there justice after this terrible crime? So, very difficult. So one, I put some questions out here at the bottom. Did O.J. Simpson commit the murders? Obviously, that was the question. / did the handling of the evidence lead to that conclusion alone? I also included some notes on this slide that I'd like to read over. It says, the judicial process followed fair procedures, and this is my writing, but I wanted to make sure not to miss this. Fair procedures, and almost ended in a mistrial several times. That being said, the argument could be made that some of the procedural minutiae actually impeded genuine justice. Other issues, such as the imperfections in which the evidence was handled and the racist statements of one of the main detectives, are important factors, but did not mean that O.J. Simpson did not commit the murders. The fact that no other credible suspects emerged, the timeline in which O.J. Simpson was seen that night, Simpson's past violent behavior toward his ex-wife, the fact that a glove with DNA from the two victims and O.J. Simpson was found at the crime scene, and its twin was found with blood, with the same blood of the victims at Simpson's residence, also with the DNA of the two victims and Simpson, and the fact that the blood of all three victims was found in Simpson's vehicle demonstrates a powerful case for conviction. The case, though, became emblematic of other issues. Obviously, the racial issue, but that's somewhat low-hanging fruit to point out that race became an issue in the O.J. Simpson case. It became emblematic of several issues and the justice system overall. And so, while I wouldn't say that this case was like one of my favorite movies, 12 Angry Men, in which there's the deck is stacked against this person, and bias is stacked against this person already, and through the asking of questions, they undo kind of the case against the defendant and develop a case for reasonable doubt. The ultimate question is whether these issues of the mishandling of evidence, plus the personal attitudes and words of law enforcement, create a case for reasonable doubt. Was reasonable doubt really created? Or was it really a case of, was other cases of police brutality and racism and the racism of Mark Fuhrman worse than the committing of a murder? And was that reflected by the jury? Not that you should necessarily weigh those as an ethical balance, but it is something to think through. So these issues caused controversy, understandably, and the whole country was virtually able to watch the trial in real time and became something of a court of public opinion. Now, in terms of justice, there's a lot of focus on procedural law and how it was handled with regard to O.J. Simpson, but was justice done on behalf of Nicole Brown Simpson and Ronald Goldman? So that's the question that ought to be asked as well. And the victims, was justice done for them? Because the murder took place, the murders took place. The murderer, if not Simpson, was not caught. So was justice done by this not guilty verdict of O.J. Simpson? And it's very difficult to say definitively. I don't think so. I think that O.J. did commit the murders, but I do have an appreciation of the system in which procedures protect and allow for a minimization of error and tyranny in the system. That was the reaction explanation. So this is obviously a high trial. The high profile trial definitely ensured the widespread public awareness and interest about a specific issue in the news. I was reminded of a book and a particular chapter in a book by Larry Sabato, political commentator, on this concept of a feeding frenzy. And Sabato speaks about the nature of American media and journalism, and how the competitive nature of journalism, the era of what he calls omnipresent journalism, and he talks about the daily coverage of an event, the race to be first to tell a story, the ability to make assumptions before having all the facts, and the fear of a competitor in the news media reaching the story first and it not being interesting anymore by the time somebody else gets to. It creates a feeding frenzy where everybody tries to rush to conclusions and instead of reporting facts. So Sabato takes a negative attitude toward this, mostly based on anecdotal evidence. But his observations are insightful. I don't know if his case necessarily that American journalism is maybe worse. I don't know if he'd use that word anyway, because American journalism, any journalism, is always in a free press, always had these elements. Although he does bring up something important in the idea of the omnipresent journalism and the 24-hour news cycle and the constant reporting and the opportunities for problem there. Now, this is surely a problem that arose a factor, not a problem necessarily, in the Simpson case. Now, but the principle is, this is one of the things, consequences we deal with an American type free press. It's built into the First Amendment, the issues notwithstanding. And so we follow the principle in general of the First Amendment that the freedoms and rights based on a free press and an independent press, which is another topic, is of more value, is more valuable than the problems that we might face in dealing with the consequences of a free press. And so, anyway, he talks about that feeding frenzy, which definitely something comes up in the O.J. Simpson case. Coverage was a mix of bias and objective. There was a sense in which, since everything's being televised and there's transcripts and you can watch it and it's a matter of public record, you can't say, all of a sudden, it's hard to make a direct lie necessarily. Not impossible, but it becomes more difficult to say something happened in the courtroom when people can look it up and see that it didn't happen. Not that couldn't affect something, but it's not the lie. It's directly. It's usually the spin. It's usually the perspective. It's usually how they choose to write on it. It's the think pieces. It's what they decide to show and what context they decide to show it in which the bias comes from. So that's the lens through which we interpret it. So there's always that. So the televised proceedings limited some of that, but bias is inherent and is always going to affect interpretation. Now notice on the left here in the screen, the Time magazine famous picture of O.J. Simpson's mugshot, An American Tragedy on Time. Now, very famous picture, caused some controversy during the case itself because the question was, did Time edit the photo in such a way to make Simpson look darker? Is this a kind of more sinister image maybe? And were there racial tones involved in this? So this, of course, comes up. Move on. According to one article, they did let's see if I talked about this here. Okay. They did a telephone survey and talked to different people about different elements coming up in the case. And they boiled it down to really 7 common themes that were coming up. Obviously, race, but also domestic violence, socioeconomic status, police abuse, judicial reform, and race relations, and then factual analysis of reasonable doubt. So all of these things were not necessarily exhaustive or limited to these things, but these were themes that we would recognize were things that were coming to people's minds throughout the O.J. Simpson case, coming out in their words. So survey results demonstrated that many people had little faith in other Americans to remain objective. Now, they would not have that view of themselves, but they would have that view of others. And it's interesting, but not surprising necessarily, that the more educated the person was, the less they trusted others with their reactions to like television media or other things like that. This is a theory that has some evidence that I was reading about called third person effect perceptual bias hypothesis, which basically states that people perceive media coverage to exert a greater amount of influence on others than on themselves. Now, that may or may not be true, and there's some issues even with the third person effect, perceptual bias, but it's basically the idea that people believe themselves, we believe ourselves to remain objective, but we wouldn't necessarily trust others to remain as objective as we are. And there's some warrant for that, and some reasons to think that, and maybe they would be, maybe they wouldn't be. But that distrust seems to be a common theme in people that's called third person effect perceptual bias, which then led a lot of people during the OJ case and others to want to watch the OJ case, know what was happening, but also not trust others to interpret it aright, to get the right conclusions, to understand it in what they believed was an objective way, understanding what was actually happening and going on. So they believed other people to be biased or misled, but not themselves. And let me comment further on this Time Magazine mugshot picture. So the controversy arose. Here's a Newsweek version of it in which Simpson, the same picture of the mugshot, as you can see, but different lighting, different way of presenting it. So, the question is, was this intentional? Was it unconscious? Doesn't matter. Were they trying to send a message about race? Were they trying to send a message about guilt or innocence? So all this came up, but this is part of the media controversy. And there's something to also be said about the fact that whether this is intentional or not, or anything like that, it sells. All this stuff sells. People are seeing it. They're recognizing it. They're buying it. And so this is, any press is good press in this sense, for if you're working for the press for this type of high-profile case. Reaction defense. Some research demonstrates that policymakers and elites are moved to action based on their beliefs about the public's reaction to media. So a lot of people would lean toward limiting the media because they distrust others' ability to remain objective. And there's some evidence to show that policymakers and elites may move in this direction as well. There was a discussion of Judge Ito's decision to allow the media in the courtroom. Should this have been televised? I mean, the court is a public record, but the nature of television could arguably be different. The Supreme Court to this day does not televise their proceedings, and that tradition has been upheld, and liberal and conservative justices have agreed with that position. So it could have been argued that, and Ito's been criticized for allowing cameras in the courtroom in the first place, and doubtless that not just cameras, but news person, all this stuff who kind of allowed, front seat at the table, adds a different layer of difficulty. But there could have been, I don't know, theoretically, if he disallowed it, that could have caused its own controversy. He was definitely criticized by the judge in the civil case, who did not allow that level of media involvement. Though it was still in the media. It was still one of the big focuses. People were still talking about O.J. Simpson even after the murder trial. So, there's also the environment of, which is hard to say. Did people change based on the fact that they knew that they were being filmed? I've heard that there's in terms of being on a reality television show, that people feel funny with the cameras at first, but then eventually kind of forget that they're there and take them for granted, and it doesn't matter. On the other hand, I think there's a chilling effect. We act differently when we know we're being filmed. Plus, now the cases are not just being made to the jury. The jury is making the final decision, but the cases are being made before a larger media audience or a wider audience. And so, is there an element of performance? Is there an element of fanfare? Is there an element of making the case for people who are not present in that room? Is there an element of focus group response? There were different changes based on what the prosecution and defense viewed on how people were viewing them, understanding them, their personalities, and different things. OJ comes off as likable. Johnny Cochran comes off as which he was, an excellent speaker, defender of issues, particularly within the Black community. But Chris Darden, a Black lawyer for the prosecution, doesn't come off that way. Marcia Clark cuts her hair, and that becomes an issue of controversy. All these different things, behaviors that might have been different if media was not in the courtroom. Although there is order maintained. There are moments, excitable moments in the case, but orders maintained, and Ito does appear to remain impartial, even when Mark Furman was found to have made comments about Judge Ito's own wife, who was a police officer as well. And so all these difficult issues, plus, as I'll mention in a few minutes, the fact that this is a celebrity case, like it or not, brings in people who want to be on the jury. I mean, I don't know that many people who want to go, are excited to go to jury duty. But this case, everybody wants to get on the jury. And there were so many difficulties, people who had connections with OJ, connections with each other, and getting the right jurors and the juror selection, making the process even longer. So Ito follows procedure that can be said for him. But I mean, there's just all this difficulty and challenges in kind of what I assume is kind of a new area of law. How do you interact with these two things? So jurors, it is important to keep in mind, the jurors are isolated from the outside world during the trial. So they're not seeing this media. They're not seeing all this stuff in the same way. They're being presented with the evidence and things in the courtroom, but they're isolated. But the longer that that's happening, the more stir crazy and frustrated they're becoming, and the less focused on maybe even the case itself. And so the jurors are kind of excluded from a lot of this media hype, but they're right there in the room. So, it is interesting to talk about how the media affected the O.J. Simpson case, but it can't really be argued necessarily that the media caused the jury to vote any type of way, because they're not allowed to interact with that stuff. Alternative explanations, it could be argued. I think strong arguments could be made for either side. that Ito could have disallowed cameras in the courtroom. That could have been the case. But that could just be coming from the third person effect perceptual bias, in the sense that people didn't, once they saw how others were reacting to the O.J. Simpson case, did not want cameras in there because they did not want that before other people who they did not trust to interpret the case the same way that they did. On the other hand, it could be argued that courts are a public record. The media is part of this. So while it may be difficult, it's ought to be welcome there. So the Simpson case is also something that could be criticized in its length, but this is a larger critique of the criminal justice system in general. And many courts will prefer mediation. There are many plea bargains that take place because the courts are overloaded and overwhelmed with cases, because the go-to to solve many problems, I'm not talking about necessarily criminal problems, but is the courts. And so the longer the case goes, the more justice either way is delayed. And the Simpson case is remembered for its length. However, this is not unusual in modern criminal proceedings. Other cases that have even more evidence of clear evidence of guilt and all these things that are not high-profile celebrity cases, not wealthy defendants, don't have these racial elements, all this stuff, often take just as long. Judicial procedures are often also the creations of courtrooms, not necessarily legislation. So many of these developments evolved in order to provide fairness and protect the genuinely innocent. However, the risk is that these procedural issues can become a shelter for wrongdoers. Now, that's always been the case. There's been an instance in which the American judicial system, post the Salem witch trials, developed the presumption of innocence, which is probably one of the most valuable aspects of American legal theory, in which the prosecution must prove the case and the defense before the law is innocent until proven guilty. But the justice system itself can be strangled by a lengthy process in the goal of what I would call humanistic legal perfectionism, in the sense that the procedures must be perfect or else there can be no just result. And this is a tricky issue, because I look at cases on the Innocence Project website, in which DNA totally exonerates people who are falsely imprisoned, maybe pled guilty, maybe were misidentified, whatever the case may be. And it exonerates them with true DNA evidence of crimes they did not commit but were convicted for. Or they pled guilty to get a lighter sentence. On the other hand, there are people who are clearly guilty, and the evidence demonstrates it, but who escape the condemnation of the law through procedural minutia. And that's one of the facts of the imperfect world in which we live. Is we want to have a system that minimizes error and tyranny, but there is no perfect system. And the sooner we recognize that, the better. And the more just results we can have. But there's also the larger problem of the overloading of the judicial system in the first place, which is cultural as well as legal. alternatives. What could they have done differently? It's hard to say in the OJ case what could have been done differently. The police and investigators could have definitely handled the evidence more carefully. They could have font. Not taken some evidence home with them in their trunk. They could have been more scrupulous with gathering the blood and the DNA evidence and examining it. All this stuff, but the OJ case wasn't necessarily a failure of procedure, if we call it a failure of the justice system. It could even be argued that it was a case of jury nullification, that the jury nullification can often mean that the jury believes that the law is misapplied or not justified in a case, so they could vote not guilty to let somebody off if they're guilty of a crime. This happened sometimes during the lead up to the Civil War, that some free states did not want to enforce slavery and fugitive slave laws, so they would vote not guilty of someone who was a captured fugitive slave. And they would nullify the law because they believed themselves to be judges of the law and fact. And so they were doing something arguably just. Here, they could have been doing, following a similar process, but it works both ways. And it also means that people could vote guilty despite what the evidence shows. So there's problems with that, with jury nullification, although it may be a technicality or even a right. But I think there are some things we need to understand. I think it's good to have an understanding of the difficulty of trying to apply quote unquote normal procedures in such a high profile case. That can a normal court process really have taken place with a celebrity? Also, the difficulty of the jury selection during a celebrity case. I think what could be criticized, and this is not just for the OJ case, but just an overall criticism of the justice system being what it is and having the value that it does. But, and I've shared this quote before, but the idea of perfectionism in procedure while missing the overall justice of or for two murder victims, and bringing the condemnation of the law against the perpetrator. Let me read this quote from the book by Fleming called the Cost of Perfect Justice. So the fuel that powers the modern legal engine is the ideal of perfectibility, the concept that with the expenditure of sufficient time, patience, energy, and money, it is possible eventually to achieve perfect justice in all legal process. For the past 20 years, this was written in 1974, for the past 20 years, this ideal has dominated legal thought, and the ideal has been widely translated into legal action. For example, in criminal prosecutions, we find as long as 5 months spent in the selection of a jury. The same murder charge tried 5 different times. The same issues of search and seizure reviewed over and over again. Conceivably, as many as 26 different times. Prosecutions pending a decade or more. Accusations routinely sidestepped by an accused who makes the legal machinery the target instead of his own conduct. This was written in 1974, about 20 years before the Simpson case, speaking of the issue of the idea that justice and the legal machinery involving humans has no cost, or that there is no cost too high for perfect justice. But there is a cost. Everything has economic costs. Everything costs time, money, patience, energy, resources. And it's just like saying, well, there's no cost for safety in terms of a car, but our cars all go faster than 5 miles an hour. So obviously there's some cost benefit there, right? It's how many. It's not necessarily that you weigh lives against safety or something like that, like was done with, I believe, the Ford Pinto or something, but that justice itself requires resources, judges, others involved in the process, and has a costs to it. And the cost of trying to achieve perfect justice, ironically and paradoxically, can often mean that the process of justice is slowed down so much that instead of arriving at perfect justice, the legal system itself is paralyzed to respond to criminal activity, so that those in the process cannot achieve that result. Others are discouraged from entering the process because they realize the time it will take to achieve any chance of a just result. And those who do or would commit criminal activity are advantaged in the sense that they now have a justice system paralyzed with so many details that it cannot possibly deal effectively with criminal activity, with true criminal activity. I'm talking about victimless crimes, I'm talking about murder, rape, things of this nature, theft. So these are huge problems, the justice system. And it comes, I believe, from this idea of perfectibility. So it's hard to say directly what could have been done just procedurally differently besides some handling of evidence. Besides that, there would have to be this shift in thinking toward the system overall. Here's a page of references here, of course, where I just quoted Fleming, The Price for Perfect Justice. This helpful article by Lassiter, the O.J. Simpson verdict, a lesson in black and white, but he's actually talking about journalism is the main focus there. Mueller, this was a very helpful article as well as an introduction. The O.J. Simpson and the Criminal Justice System on Trial is an introduction to a series of essays, but his introduction is very helpful in laying out the facts of the case itself, the defense's case and the prosecution's case. The O.J. Simpson on Trial, Samwin versus Driscoll, Consequences of Third-Person Perception. This was very interesting and helpful. Sabato's Feeding Frenzy, Sowell's The Quest for Cosmic Justice, Tar, the textbook that I used to discuss a little bit of some of the numbers of people watching Simpson's case. And then this interesting article on the DNA evidence of Simpson's trial and some of the questioning of that. And then the case itself, the people of the state of California versus Orenthal James Simpson, 1995.